I worked the ladder for 41 years before it spoke to me, and for 40 of them I believed I had wasted my life. You have to understand what the ladder was. It was 9 terraces cut into the cold flank of a mountain on a world we called Lowater, which is a frontier name, a settler's joke, because there was never enough of it. The terraces climbed from the river road at the bottom to the fallow top, and on every one of them somebody's grandmother had once planted an orchard, and on most of them the orchards had died. My family held the 3rd and 4th terraces from the river. They were stone-cold ground that took everything you gave and gave back about 1/3 of it in a good year, and there had not been many good years. I tell you this so you understand I was nobody. I want that on the record because of everything that came after. The part people get wrong is the part where they decide I must have been somebody all along, somebody hidden, a lost heir, a secret blood. I was not. I was a grower with cracked hands and a bad back, and the only thing I ever did that mattered I did 10,000 times without knowing it mattered. Above the 9th terrace, on the fallow top where nothing grew and nothing had ever grown in living memory, there was the cradle. That was not what we called it. We called it the stone egg or the sleeper or the old people the long patience, though none of us knew why they called it that. It sat half sunk in the dead soil of the top terrace, pale as a peeled almond, taller than my father's barn and longer than it was tall, smooth on its faces, and seamed down its length the way a seed is seamed. No moss took to it. No frost stuck to it. In the worst winters, when the river itself went hard and the stock froze in the byres, you could climb to the fallow top and lay your hand on the cradle and feel it was neither warm nor cold, only still, the way deep water is still. I knew it my whole life. Every child on the ladder knew it. We were told not to climb to it, and we all climbed to it, and we put our ears to its shell and heard nothing, and we dared each other to sleep beside it, and none of us ever did. It was simply there, the way the mountain was there, the way the double sun came up pale and doubled over the eastern ridge every morning of the world. But I am old, and you are young, and you only know the cradle from the way it is now, with the road built up to it, and the people who come from off-world to stand at the rope and look. So let me tell you what it had been before any of us, because that is the part that matters, and it is the part I learned last of all. The cradle had been there an age, not a long time, an age. Before the settlers, before the river road, before there was a name for Lowater or a reason to come to it, the cradle sat on that cold slope and waited, and it had been found before, many times, by people far greater than we ever were. Empires found it. This is true, and it is written, if you go to the deep archives off-world and pay to be let in, which I never did, but a scholar told me and I believe her. 3 separate powers across the long age came to Lowater for no reason but the cradle, because their instruments had felt the thing asleep inside it and known that it was old and that it was strong, and the strong are drawn to the strong the way water runs downhill. The first came with priests and tried to wake it with words. They sang to it in the high tongues, they burned offerings on the dead terrace, they pressed their anointed kings against its shell and named those kings by every great name they had, and the cradle did not stir. It did not so much as warm under their hands. They left, and their empire is dust now, and the only proof they were ever on the ladder is a ring of scorched stones the plow turns up, which we used to think was a hearth. The second came with engines. This was a harder people, a colder one, and they did not ask the cradle anything. They meant to take what was inside. They brought cutting beams that could open a mountain, and they laid them against the seam of the shell, and they burned for 40 days. And the scholar said the records show their commanders growing first impatient and then afraid, because the beams did nothing. The shell did not scorch. It did not heat. It drank the fire the way dead ground drinks rain and gave nothing back. And after 40 days the cold people packed their engines and left. And somewhere in the archive there is a single line from their last commander that the scholar read to me and that I have never forgotten. He wrote, "It is not sealed against force. It is sealed against us." He did not know what he meant, but he was right, and it took me 40 years and one frost to learn how right. The third power that came was the worst, because it was the cleverest. It did not bring kings or beams. It brought patience of its own. It set scholars on the ladder for a generation, and they measured the cradle every way a thing can be measured, and they wrote that the seam would open to the correct key, and they spent 30 years building keys. They built keys of sound and keys of blood and keys of light. They pressed the cleverest minds of their age against the shell and the strongest, and the noblest born, and the ones their tests said were the finest examples their people had ever produced, and the cradle weighed every one of them in the long stillness behind its shell, and found, every time, that they were not the thing it waited for, and it did not open. And here is what I have come to believe, old as I am, with my hand on the warm shell of it as I tell you this. They all failed for the same reason, and it was not that they were unworthy. Most of them were better people than I am. They failed because they all came to the cradle to take, and the cradle was not waiting to be taken. It was waiting to be tended. Those are different hungers, and only one of them ever climbs the ladder in a killing frost to cover a sapling that everyone with sense has already given up for dead. That sapling was mine, and I should tell you about it, because it is the whole of the story, though I did not know that either. I planted it on the 8th terrace, which is to say one below the fallow top, one below the cradle, in ground that my own father had told me would take nothing. He was not wrong about much, and he was not wrong about that. The 8th terrace was the worst of the 9, thin soil over cold rock, in the shadow of the ridge for half the short day. Nobody planted the 8th. It was understood. You worked the lower terraces where the river warmed the air, and you let the high ground be. I planted the 8th anyway, and I will tell you why, and it is not a noble reason. I planted it because I could not stand the look of it. Bare ground above my orchard, year after year, the dead top above that with the cradle sitting in it like a held breath. I had a notion, never more than a notion, that an orchard wants to climb, that if you give ground a chance long enough, it remembers how to be green. I had no science for it. I had 40 years of putting seedlings into bad soil and losing most of them and trying again. And somewhere in those 40 years, the trying had stopped being a thing I did and become a thing I was. So I planted the 8th, one sapling, a hard little frost pear grafted on the toughest root I had, and I lost it the first year, and I planted another, and I lost that, and the third one lived. I do not know why the third one lived. I have thought about it. I gave it nothing the other two did not get. But it took, on the worst ground on the ladder in the shadow of the ridge, one terrace below the long patience, and it put out 4 true leaves and held them, and I went up the 8th every single morning of that whole season to look at it, and I am not ashamed to tell you I talked to it. Growers talk to what they grow. The clever people who came to the cradle would have called that nothing, a habit, an old woman's foolishness. But I have come to think it was the most important thing I ever did, and I did it without a thought, the way you breathe. I warmed its seed against my chest the winter before I sowed it, because that is what my grandmother taught me, that a hard seed is not a dead seed. It is only a cold one that does not yet believe in spring, and your own warmth can teach it to believe. I sang to the sapling low when the wind was bad, not because I thought it could hear, but because I could not stand for it to be up there alone in the cold and silent. When seedlings died on me, and across 40 years thousands died on me, I did not throw them on the heap. I turned them back into the ground that killed them by hand, every one, because it seemed to me that a thing that had tried to live had earned that much, not to be wasted. I am telling you the small things because the small things are the whole of it. The empires brought their best, and the cradle weighed their best and found it wanting. And all that time, what the cradle was waiting for was a woman who would warm a hard seed against her chest because she could not bear for it to give up, and bury a dead seedling by hand because it had tried. It was not waiting for the strong. It had never been waiting for the strong. It was waiting for a tender, and across the whole long age, with all those great powers climbing the ladder, I do not think one of them ever brought it a tender, until the frost the year I was 62. That frost came early and it came hard, the kind that comes down off the high ridge in the dark and is on you before the suns are up. I knew it was coming the evening before. You learn the smell of it. I went to bed afraid, the way a grower is always afraid, and I lay awake thinking of the frost pear on the 8th terrace, my one sapling on the worst ground, 3 years grown now and just beginning to think about fruiting, and I thought, it will not live through this. And I could have let it go. I want you to know I could have. I was 62 and my back was bad and I had lost 1,000 better trees than that one, on better ground, and any grower on the ladder would have told me the 8th terrace pear was a fool's tree that should never have been planted and was not worth the climb. They would have been right by every measure that the clever people used. I got up in the dark anyway. I took the old quilts I kept for exactly this, the cover cloths, and I took my lantern, and I climbed past my own orchard on the 3rd and 4th, past the silent terraces above, up toward the 8th in a cold that bit through everything I owned. The frost had not fully come down yet, but it was coming. I could feel it gathering on the high ground, that stillness that is not peace. And I climbed into it, an old woman with an armful of quilts to cover one tree. This is the small gesture. People who tell the story want it to be grand. They want me to have gone up there for the cradle, to have known, to have been called. I went up for the pear. That is the truth, and I will not let it be made into anything else. The cradle was not in my mind at all. It was simply above me, the way it always was, the long patience sitting in the dead top terrace. And as I came up onto the 8th in the failing dark, struggling with the cover cloths and the lantern and my own bad knees, I lost my footing on the frost-slick stone of the terrace wall, and I put my hand out to catch myself, and what I caught was the cold, smooth shell of the cradle. I had laid my hand on it 10,000 times as a child. I knew exactly how it would feel. Neither warm nor cold, only still, the deep-water stillness. I caught myself against it the way you catch yourself against any wall, and I stood there a moment getting my breath, my bare palm flat on the shell, the lantern swinging, the pear forgotten for one heartbeat, while I made sure I was not going to fall down the terrace and break my old neck in the dark. And under my hand the stillness moved. I have tried for the rest of my life to describe it, and I cannot do it properly. It was not heat, though it became heat. It was not light, though the light came after. It was recognition. That is the closest word, and it is not close enough. It was the feeling of being a single name spoken in a silence that had held its breath and age waiting to speak it, and the name was not Marin, and it was not air, and it was not chosen. It was something older than a name. It was the feeling a seed must have, if a seed can feel, in the first warm hour when it stops being a hard, cold, dead-seeming thing and remembers, against all the long winter, that it was always meant to be green. I did not pull my hand away. I want you to mark that too, because I have thought about it. Every great power that came to the cradle came to make it do something. When it moved under my hand, my whole life of tending moved in me first, before fear, and what I did was the thing I had done 10,000 mornings on the 8th terrace. I went still, and I let it be what it was going to be, the way you let a sprout come up at its own hour and do not pull at it to hurry it, because pulling at a living thing to hurry it is how you kill it. I held my hand where it was, and I waited with it, and I think that waiting was the last of the key. Not my blood, not my words. The fact that when the oldest thing on the world woke under my hand, my instinct was not to take from it but to wait with it. The light came then. It came up under the shell from deep inside, the way dawn comes up under cloud, a paleness first and then a glow, running along the seam that ran the length of the cradle, the seam that 3 empires had sung to and burned and measured and could not open. It ran the length of it in a line of light no wider than a thread, and where my hand lay on the shell the light gathered and bloomed. A soft, slow starburst spreading out from under my palm, warm now, warm as a living thing, warm as a seed held to the chest of someone who could not bear for it to give up. I heard a sound behind me and below me on the terraces. It was Edrin, my neighbor from the 5th, who had also smelled the frost coming and had also climbed in the dark, though for his stock, and not for any fool tree. He had come up to see my lantern stopped on the 8th and climbed toward it to see if the old woman had fallen, and what he saw instead was the long patience lit from within along its whole length, and me standing against it with my hands sunk in a pool of light. He did not come closer. He told me after that he could not. He stood on the 7th terrace with his mouth open and his own lantern forgotten in his hand, and he made a sound I had never heard a grown man make, not fear. He was always firm about that, not fear but something with no word, the sound you would make if the mountain itself had opened an eye. And others came. The frost had brought half the ladder out that night to save what they could, and the light could be seen from the river road. And one by one they climbed, and one by one they stopped where they could see, on the lower terraces, in a ragged half-circle below the fallow top, and not one of them came up onto the 8th, and not one of them spoke. They only watched, with their lanterns dying in their hands and their faces turned up and lit from below by the glow of the thing waking, and on every face was the same thing, and it was not fear and it was not greed. It was wonder, pure wonder, the kind a person feels perhaps once in a life, the kind that empties you out and leaves room for something larger to come in. And in my coat pocket against my hip, I felt the old seed stir. I should have told you about the seed. I had carried it for 30 years. It came to me from my grandmother who had it from hers, a single hard black seed the size of a thumbnail, heavier than any seed has a right to be, with a seam down it like the cradle's own. Nobody in my family had ever known what it was. The story was only that it had been found on the fallow top in the time of the first settlers, turned up by a plow near the base of the Long Patience, and that it had been kept ever since because it seemed wrong to throw away a thing that had been waiting so long. I had tried in my foolish years to sprout it. Of course I had. I had warmed it against my chest 100 winters. I had sown it in my best ground and my worst. It never moved. It never split. It was a hard, cold, dead-seeming thing, and I kept it the way you keep a thing that has been kept too long to ever let go, in my coat pocket, against my hip, where over 30 years it had worn a smooth black place in the lining. It stirred now. I felt it come awake against me the way the cradle had come awake under my hand, the same recognition, the same waking, and I understood, standing there with my palm in the light and that small heaviness warming at my hip, that they were the same thing. The seed and the cradle, the small and the great. That what slept in the cradle was the parent, and what I had carried 30 years in my pocket was the child, or the seed of one, turned up by a plow an age ago, and kept and warmed every winter by a line of growers who never knew what they held, until at last it was carried up the ladder in a killing frost by one who climbed for the love of a tree. The seam of the cradle opened. It did not crack. It did not burst. The empires who came to break it open would not have known the word for what it did, because it was not the word they knew. It opened the way a seed opens, the way a bud opens. The two long faces of the shell drawing back along the lit seemed slow and sure and patient. An age of patience ending in the only way it could ever have ended, gently, for the one hand that had come gently. Warm light poured out of it onto the dead top terrace, onto the frost, onto my face, and on the lower terraces I heard the whole ladder draw one breath together. And out of the light, into the silence that 3 empires had filled with kings and engines and clever keys and never once filled with the right thing, came a voice. I will not tell you it spoke in any tongue. It did not. It spoke in me, the way the recognition had been in me, the way the warmth had been in me, a meaning that arrived already understood, in a voice that was old past any age I could hold in my mind and yet was not grand, was not terrible, was not a king's voice nor a god's. It was, of all the things it could have been, kind. It was the kindest voice I have ever heard, and it has been in me every day since, and it said 2 words, and the 2 words undid and remade every year of the life I had thought I wasted. It said, "Hello, gardener." I am an old woman and I have wept perhaps 4 times in my life that I will admit to, and that was one of them, and I am not ashamed of it. I stood with my hand in the light of the open cradle, and the sun's just beginning to pale the eastern ridge and the whole ladder watching from below. And the oldest living thing on the world greeted me as you would greet someone you had been expecting a long while, with no surprise in it at all, only a kind of settling, a kind of at last, and it called me by the only title it had ever been waiting to give, which was not queen and was not heir and was not maker. It was gardener, the smallest word, the truest one. I asked it not aloud. I do not think I could have spoken aloud. I asked it why me. I had to. 40 years of believing I had wasted my life does not let go of you in a heartbeat, even with the light pouring over your face. Why me when kings came? Why me when they brought you their best and their strongest and their cleverest and you weighed them and let them go? Why an old woman with a bad back and a fool's tree? And it answered me, and I have spent the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the answer, and I will give it to you as near to true as I can. It told me that the ones who made it, it called them only by a feeling, a sense of an old green people long gone, world shapers, who went out into the dead places of the dark and taught dead worlds to be alive, and who knew, being old, that they would not last, that no people lasts. Those makers had faced the question every dying thing faces, which is what to leave behind. And they had looked at the powers of their age, the strong ones, the takers, the ones who would surely come after them and find the cradles they left, and they had understood something that it took me 40 years and one frost to understand. They had understood that the strong cannot be trusted with the work of growing, because the strong have never had to learn patience, and growing is nothing but patience. A king can take a world in a season. It takes a gardener a lifetime to teach one bad terrace to be green. And the teaching cannot be hurried, and the one who tries to hurry it kills it. So they had not left their last cradle to wake for the strong. They had set it to wait, however long it took, an age if it took an age, for a hand that had given its whole life to coaxing reluctant life from hard ground and never once given up. Not because such a hand was rare among the great, because such a hand was never great. It was always small, always overlooked, always somebody's grandmother on a dying terrace, and the strong who came hunting power would never think to send for her, and so the cradle would be safe. And so when at last it woke, it would wake in the hands of the only kind of person who could be trusted with what it carried, which was the seed of a living world. I had warmed a hard seed against my chest because I could not bear for it to give up. The makers had measured the age waiting for exactly that, and no king had ever offered it, and I had offered it 10,000 times without knowing I was being weighed. The seed came out of my pocket then. I did not take it out. It lifted, the small black heaviness, drawn into the light between my hand and the open shell, and it turned in the air slow, the way a thing turns when it is being looked at after a very long time by the one who has missed it, and the cradle's light gathered around it, and the seam down its side split at last, after 30 years in my pocket and an age in the dark of the fallow top, and a single thread of green came out of it, no bigger than the first true leaf of a frost pear, and it lived. I do not know how to make you feel what that was. I had failed to sprout that seed for 30 years. It came alive in the air over the dead top terrace in a killing frost, and the frost did not touch it. And on the lower terraces 100 people who had come up to save their stock from the cold knelt down without knowing they did it. That is most of the story. The rest you can read in the off-world archives now, where the same scholars who once measured the shell now measure what came out of it, and where they have given me names I do not answer to. They want me to be the heir of the green people. I am not. The green people are gone in age, and I am no kin of theirs. I am a settler's grandchild from a dying terrace, and the cradle was never waiting for blood. They want the seed to be a weapon, or an engine, or a power, the way the empires wanted what was inside to be a power. It is not. It is what it always was. It is the seed of a living world, and it cannot be planted by the strong, because the strong would hurry it, and it cannot be planted by the clever, because the clever would measure it to death. It can only be planted by a gardener, slowly, in bad ground, by a hand that has learned across a lifetime not to pull at a living thing to make it hurry. And there are more of us than you would think. and we were never the ones anyone sent for. I am very old now. The 8th terrace is green to the top. The frost pair I climbed to save that night lived and bore, and its children are on the 7th and the 6th. And the fallow top where nothing had ever grown is an orchard now, and the cradle stands open in the middle of it, quiet again, its work done, warm to the hand on the coldest day of the year. People come from off-world to stand at the rope and look at it, and they ask me, the ones who are led up to where I sit, whether I always knew. Whether I felt my whole life that I was meant for something, whether there was a sign. There was no sign. I want that to be the last thing. I was nobody, and I wasted nothing, though for 40 years I believed I had wasted everything. And the truth that the long patience taught me in 2 kind words on a frozen morning is the truth I would leave you with. You who are young, you who are sure you are nobody, and sure your small faithful work is wasted in hard ground that gives back 1/3 of what you give it. The strong are not the ones the old powers waited for. They never were. Somewhere there is a cradle waiting an age in the dark for the one hand gentle enough to wake it, and it will not be a king's hand, and it will not be a clever hand, and it will not come down in glory. It will be your hand, cracked and cold, reaching out in the dark to cover one fool tree that everyone with sense has already given up for dead. Be the one who climbs anyway. The age is patient. It is waiting to call you by your true name, and the name is smaller and truer than you think. And when at last you lay your tired hand against the long stillness of the thing you were always meant to wake, it will know you the way I was known, and it will say to you what was said to me, gently, after all that waiting, with no surprise in it at all. Hello, gardener.